Imposter syndrome is the feeling like you don't deserve what you have, and that one day you might be exposed as a fraud. This is quite often felt with newer artists who are sharing their work online and they don't feel like they have the appropriate skill set. So when they're sharing their work, they're thinking, oh, I hope someone doesn't come and ruthlessly overanalyze my techniques because I don't know much about it myself. This is something that I think everyone deals with to some degree, and it can be quite detrimental when it comes to sharing your work online, because you'll be feeling hyper anxious about what other people will think about your work. On the flip side of that, sometimes imposter syndrome can be a good thing because it encourages you to keep learning to try and keep up with other people. But one thing I think new artists really need to understand is that just having all the technical knowledge doesn't necessarily get rid of this feeling. Even highly professional artists at the top of the game still get the feeling of imposter syndrome when looking at other people's work, because they'll think, wow, this is really cool stuff. Why didn't I think about this before? Oh, does my stuff pale in comparison to this? It really boils down to a common sense of insecurity, which I think comes down to an innate desire to compare success with other people. You know, imagine you create like hundreds of pieces of artwork that get barely any attention, and then you spend just a little bit of effort creating this one mediocre piece in your opinion, and you put it out there and it gets tons of attention, tons of likes, and you think, well, do I really deserve that? Because I spent all this effort on all these other pieces, and then I've just spent just a tiny amount of time on this, and now everyone likes this. That's the sort of moments when imposter syndrome tends to flare up, because something doesn't make sense here. It's a feeling of I've received something, but I don't feel like the amount of effort I put into it warrants that success. Therefore, it doesn't match up with my preconceived notion of hard work equals success. So right now I feel like an imposter. It's tricky to try and find a way to not feel like that, especially in a creative space like this, because artwork inherently should not be comparative. You know, it shouldn't be graded next to other pieces of artwork because it's largely subjective and in many cases open to the interpretation of the viewer. But at the same time, because artwork in especially the 3D space is branching into technical fields as well, the competitive element becomes a lot more present, especially when we're talking about applying for jobs online. Because in cases like that, we have hundreds or thousands of people applying for a specific role, and of course the company only wants to take on the best that they can get. In cases like that, artwork becomes an extremely competitive field, which is kind of contradictory to the desire of wanting to make artwork for expression. I feel like a lot of imposter syndrome comes from that dichotomy of trying to resolve the feelings of wanting to make artwork with the competitive nature of the medium itself, especially on websites like ArtStation, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, etc. Because as soon as you have ways to compare your success with other people, in the form of a like count, a view count, comments, etc., that's when insecurities start to flare up. Now, I feel like the insecurities that we have as creative technicals putting our work out into the world is fundamentally a misunderstanding of how the world works and how the world behaves. Because the idea hard work equals success is not completely true. And it's oftentimes quite hard trying to resolve that inside of our minds because that's something that's been drilled into us from a very young age. And we see this on places like YouTube, for example, where you can put very low amounts of effort into specific genres of content that do very well on the grounds of it being entertaining, for example. Now, I'm not saying that entertainment content on YouTube is inherently low effort, because most people making entertaining content put extreme amounts of effort into it. But there's definitely a subset of the genre that I would call stupid fun, which is definitely low effort and tends to get a high audience feedback. But just going back to the point, imagine that we go through school starting from a young age and all of our work is usually graded and we have to sit through exams and the exams are graded. And even if there's no direct competition element through the elimination of classmates, which would be kind of barbaric, still the element of having a value or a letter that the students can compare with other students inherently makes the whole thing competitive. So the idea is drilled in there that hard work equals success, because if you work harder and if you study harder, then you'll get a higher grade. That does not translate into the real world directly. Sure, hard work definitely increases your chances of being successful later in life, but I think the idea work smarter, not harder, is one that definitely applies to the real world more than in school, for example. Because in real life, especially on the online space, it's not about making the most things or putting the most effort into something. It's about making things that people like and putting it in the right place and getting it seen and being a bit lucky at the same time. And some people might take offense to the idea of luck being a factor in it, but what I mean by luck is all the elements that you don't have direct control over. So for example, all the other people online that could share your work, I consider that under the category of luck because you don't have control over them, it's just something that happens without you knowing. So keeping the idea of hard work equals success in your mind, and then having the example that we shared earlier, which is where you could spend just ridiculous amounts of time making hundreds of pieces of artwork and then spend just a little bit of effort on making one that does really well, those situations aren't compatible. because you spent a low amount of effort on this piece and it's done really well and made you successful. That's where imposter syndrome comes into play, because now you're trying to resolve these two things. This situation that you've been involved in is not compatible with that worldview. But how do we resolve this? I feel like just with our discussion about learning to ignore people, the resolution is something that people need to find out for themselves. Because this type of insecurity is directly related to personal emotional effects, the solution is something that can't be told to people necessarily, it's something that needs to be earned through experience. Because the solution will be unique to every individual and every personality. But if I could give advice, I would say taking the idea of hard work equals success and learning to adapt it, not completely get rid of it, but just adjust it, could lead to a way out of imposter syndrome. I've mentioned it a couple of times in videos before, but when I see new 3D artists making artwork, sometimes they fall into the trap of thinking that more detail equals better artwork. And that's usually not the case. And when I say better artwork, we're talking about generally accepted good artwork, stuff that's visually pleasing to look at, stuff that has a balance of a distribution from high to medium to small shapes. And to learn more about that, Neil Blevins did a good blog post about the distribution of shapes, and Gleb Alexandrov also did a good talk at the Blender conference, so I highly recommend watching that. So new artists sometimes put so much effort into cramming as much detail in and making as much artwork as possible, not really thinking about the balance, like the purpose of the artwork. And I feel like in doing that, they kind of missed the point of what people, the viewers, the audience that they're making the artwork for online, want to see. What they're trying to achieve is high-effort technical prowess by cramming as much in as possible, rather than going for audience reaction. And I feel like there's an opportunity for confusion there, because they'll put this artwork up and think, well, why is this not doing so well? I've put lots of technical detail into this, there's so much in there, why is it not doing as well as this low poly piece? And it's because, as we said, high effort does not equal success. The idea, the purpose, the presentation behind it. Derek Sivers said that ideas are just a multiplier of execution. You need good ideas and good execution. One or the other alone makes the work kind of useless. So I feel like to resolve imposter syndrome in some way, I feel like you need to acknowledge that the success is not going to be correlated to the amount of effort that you put into it. Instead, it's going to be directly related to the response from the audience, as well as a range of other variables like how well is the audience going to respond to the idea and the execution of that work? How likely are they going to share it with other people? How likely are they going to come back to it? And then a lot of other variables outside of your control, because the internet is so heavily controlled by algorithms for distributing content. How likely is my content going to be shared on the platform outside of my control and the control of my immediate audience? I think a fundamental misunderstanding of the platform and comparing it to our original worldviews is what causes the insecurities, which in turn lead to imposter syndrome. So perhaps the solution lies in understanding what leads to success through the experience of sharing things online and seeing what does work, what doesn't work, and then beginning to understand the effect that your work will have on other people and the world in general. And if you're worried about originality, so other people coming to your work and telling you that it's not original, that you're copying from other people, just think about this. Everyone copies from someone else. That person that's criticizing you, did they make the software that they use to do their work? If so, did they invent the computer that they're using to do their work? If so, did they invent the principles behind it? No, no one is completely original. Everyone is standing on the shoulders of someone else who is standing on the fundamental laws of physics. Unless you created the entire universe, you have no claim to being completely and utterly original. Don't be afraid of taking inspiration from other people's work, although this does kind of take us onto the subject of kit bashing and photo bashing, because this is a bit of a contentious subject that does tie in with imposter syndrome quite heavily, because sometimes people feel like they're cheating by using kit bash pieces or photo bash pieces. And though yes, if you're exclusively using them, you won't be obtaining the ideal skills for modeling or digital painting, but no, it doesn't mean that you're any less of an artist. Because by using kit bash and photo bash pieces, you're still developing compositional skills, color theory, lighting, etc. At the end of the day, it's up to you how in-depth you want to go with your skill development. And it really depends what you want to do with your work, because yes, if you're applying for a job, then you really should meet the technical requirements for that work. But if you're just making things for enjoyment, then why should it matter? Someone shouldn't come to your work and say, hey, you're not a real modeler because you're using kit bash pieces. So if you feel like an imposter for using pre-made pieces like that, then just be aware that there's no bottom line for originality. But a caveat needs to be placed here, because if you're using pieces made by other people, you're still an artist if you're making something new from it, but you need to provide credit for the people that made those pieces in the first place. You know, you can provide credit for other artists online that you've taken inspiration from or even pre-made parts from, but you don't necessarily need to provide credit to the entire universe for setting up this whole situation in the first place. Another possible way to avoid imposter syndrome is to have your hands in as many different subjects and fields as possible, because then if one comes to a complete failure, then you can think, oh, well, I've also got these things that I'm doing, I've also got this skill set that I have. And then you'll feel like, well, it doesn't really matter if I fail at one thing because there's all these other things that I'm part of. But at the same time, if you're too widely stretched with that, it can have the detrimental effect of making you feel like you're never going to be a master of one specific field. You know, a jack of all trades, but a master of none. At the end of the day, I feel like it's a good thing to experience imposter syndrome to a certain degree. It's good because it can keep you pressured to learn new things to keep up with other people, but at the same time, it can have the strong negative effect of preventing you from sharing your work online. But I think talking about the feeling and bringing it out into the air to rationalize is a good way for people to break it down and start looking at it objectively, to start separating their personal feelings and insecurities from that sensation. I would also rather work with people that had some sense of imposter syndrome than those that were completely overconfident in their work, because at least it shows some sense of modesty as well. I don't think it's anything that people should be ashamed about, and I think it's completely natural. So hopefully this video has given you some ideas and made you think about it a bit more. And if there's anyone out there who's really struggling with imposter syndrome, then all I can do is just give you the encouragement to put your work out there and try and put the insecurity aside. It's much easier said than done, I know, but I'm sure that if you keep experimenting with putting your work out there and getting some feedback in the form of confidence, then it will get better over time. Okay, since we're coming to the end of the video, we're going to take a moment to talk about the sponsor for this video, which is Sketchfab. You may already know Sketchfab for providing the best 3D model viewer for the web, but you might not know that they also have an online store for buying and selling 3D models. You can use the built-in model inspector to preview the geometry of the mesh and all of the textures so you know exactly what you're getting. There's a wide variety of content available and a good number of dedicated artists providing high quality content. If you're interested in maybe selling your own models on the store, then you can also consider applying to become a seller. Sketchfab has been well integrated with the Blender community for a long time, and continues to provide a valuable service for all kinds of artists. So thank you Sketchfab for sponsoring the video. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to follow me wherever possible. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.